Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for giving us your late afternoon on Saturday here. This panel is entitled Measuring the News Ecosystem. I have it was a four-person panel. We lost Renee. She couldn't join us, but I'm actually hoping that the role she was going to serve in this panel will possibly come from you guys. So the way this session is going to work, I'm going to let Mark and Nick introduce themselves, and then I'm going to go through some research that we've done. So my name is Matt McAllister. I'm with a company called Kaleida, which was founded a couple of years ago. We were recipients of D&I funding from that first round. And the premise of the company was that we were trying to look at the news ecosystem and measuring it, but looking quite closely at the relationship between news and platforms, and trying to build some tools that would help publishers get a better understanding of how their content is performing. So this is what I'm going to show you today is a preview of some research that we've been working on for several months, and the final report will be coming out in a few weeks, but I'm going to show you guys some of the top level numbers. So I will go through that stuff as kind of a framing for the discussion we're going to have, and then I'm going to ask Mark and Nick to talk about some of their experiences as it pertains to this subject. But before Mark and Nick introduce themselves, I do want to get a little bit of a sense of who's here. So how many people here are journalists? Okay, and how many people are not working for a professional news organization of some sort? Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm hopefully going to get some answers from some of you guys on some of the issues that I'm going to raise, because I think it should be relevant to all of you. Mark, do you want to introduce yourself? Tell us what you do at the BBC and maybe any projects that you've been working on recently that are relevant to this, or you know.
Oh, hello everybody. I'm really excited to be here. It's a fabulous festival. I think it's one of my favourite. So I am social media editor for BBC News, which means that I look after all of our social media output across BBC News in terms of our primary channels: Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, primarily a little bit of WhatsApp and Snapchat as well. I run a team that is not just publishing to those channels, but also collecting from the audience. So they're a UGC-orientated team looking at audience interactivity, looking at contributions in video, audio, and pictures from the audiences that we get, and trying to figure out the best ways of using that content across our website and all our digital output. I also have a role to play in terms of trying to figure out with senior colleagues the best use of social media strategy across the BBC News, which is no mean task, considering how fast it evolves and how quickly problems arise, but essentially that's what I do. And in terms of today, I mean, we'll get into all the measurements and things in a little while, but I've got another project that I'm about to embark on for 5 weeks in Harvard in June, which is to look at invite-only closed peer-to-peer social media networks, because I've had for some time now a sense that our audiences are shifting from noisy public spaces to private community spaces. That's been a theme, I think, of this conference in lots of the panels that I've attended, and I'm mindful of the fact that as journalists we're not very good at figuring out how best to involve ourselves in those spaces to get the best out of that audience interactivity. So that's a particular area of interest for me.
Yeah, good. I think, yeah, we'll definitely dive into that. I think that's an important topic that actually both Nick and I have some numbers on. So Nick, do you want to talk about what you do?
Yeah, it's really good to be here. Nick Newman from the Royce Institute for the Study of Journalism. And there's a lot of talk at this wonderful conference about platforms and publishers and their point of view. And I'm super excited to be on a panel that's talking about the audience. There's so much we don't know, and that's why this is my passion, is sort of thinking about the audience. I'm the lead author of the Reuters Institute Digital News Report. We've been running since 2012, covers 37 countries, looking at what audiences are doing, how they're changing, dark social, these kind of issues. And I've also done in the last year or so some work looking at not just survey, but actual data. So a little bit like Matt's data we're going to hear about. And I think that's really illuminating. In a previous life, I led product teams at the BBC. I also worked with publishers around metrics, how to use metrics, which metrics to choose, and how to optimize them. So we may get onto some of that stuff as well.
Yeah, hopefully we'll talk about all that kind of stuff. So I want to frame it with this question. So yes, a lot of people have been talking about the platform-publisher relationship, and it's been a big topic at this event. It's been a big topic for a really long time, right? So it's not just unique to this event. This is something that's been going on for a very long time. And I think one of the conclusions I've come to doing this research is that the relationship is actually working, that there's conflict, and it feels more like a sibling relationship where you've got competitive siblings who are part of the same family. And I think that will start to kind of bear out in some of the numbers that you see. But what I'd like to try and do with this discussion is think a little bit about how that dynamic should work. What would, if we could start over today, if all of a sudden we could, tomorrow switch on the internet, how would we want that relationship to work? So I'm going to give a little bit of background on our research. So the work that we did started actually with this. So a year ago, we started working with a couple of clients who wanted to know a little bit more about how Facebook, what engagements meant for them in terms of their business. And so we looked at the way their content was being shared and found that there was a high correlation between engagements on Facebook and referral traffic to those articles on the publisher's website, which means that you can start to kind of build some ratios and work out what one engagement is worth. Now, lots of caveats here. This was one case study. In fact, it was only one day for one publisher. So this is certainly not an industry standard, this figure, but it gave us the idea that we could actually start measuring the entire news ecosystem if we had enough data to work with, which is exactly what we've started to get to. But in that, in the process of doing that case study, we also started to realize you can't bank the whole thing on engagements. It's just a very unstable, currency, as it were. And we've seen this over the last several months, last year, so at least since May, perhaps longer, the number of engagements to news has been declining. The average number of engagements has been declining really quickly and quite dramatically. Strangely, that kind of stopped in January when Facebook decided they were going to deprioritize brand pages for news publishers. Don't know why exactly, but it is interesting to see how these things play out. But because of that research or that case study, we started thinking a little bit bigger. Okay, can we actually measure this? Can we count the news ecosystem in some way that gives us a sense of how big this market is and how these forces are engaging with each other? So because of that earlier research and that question, we were able to find some partners to work with. So we're working with YouGov and ComScore and PwC and some super smart statisticians who've challenged us on the way we're working on this and how we count things. And this is where I disclose that our sponsor is Google, and they're the sole sponsor. But it's important to say that this is independent research, that in the contract, they are precluded from having any authority over the output, and that has bared out. This is independent research, even though there is one sponsor for it. So this is kind of the top line figure to start with, and I'm going to start working through in these slides how we got to this. So what we're talking about is headlines seen on third-party sites, and we've been calling them news exposures. And we found that in January, so 1 month, in January of this year in Europe, that we counted 23 billion news exposures. Now that's a crazy big number. It's hard to know, is that good, is that bad? Well, that's part of why you do this kind of research. We don't really know yet. You kind of need to trend these things or put it into context. And the first context you start thinking of when you see a big number like that is, okay, well, how much is that worth? And we came through some of the math we've done, we came to the conclusion that that is worth 53 million euros. So I'll get to that in a minute. But what I want to do is explain how we're doing this work. And you'll see that there's lots of interesting lessons just in the process of doing the work that start to come out of this. So how do you count how many headlines are seen on third-party sites? So we divided the problem into two pieces. A piece that we knew we could count, and one that's a little bit fuzzier. And I tried to represent that with a slightly fuzzy image where that blue box kind of tails off at the end, and I'll explain why that is. But the one on the left we can do pretty accurately, I think. And I'm a little bit surprised that this hasn't been done before. So what we're talking about are headlines seen externally, which have resulted in a click, a visit to a publisher's website. So that's the box on the left. The one on the right, headlines seen on a third-party website but not clicked. All right, and that's kind of a crucial number in this whole discussion. But let's for now focus on this one on the left, because once you have that, then you've got some building blocks for the other pieces. So the way we arrived at this number is with help from publishers. So it was a combination of work, data that publishers gave to us. So 18 publishers across Europe all either gave us a data dump of all their activity in January, big, huge files that we had to work with, or in several cases, they gave us direct access to their analytics, so we could dive in there and query the data to get these results out. Having that data set gave us the ability to start to infer and start extrapolating so we could get out to the macro number that we're looking for. And the lever for doing that is ComScore. So ComScore, a lot of people might not agree that the numbers are precisely accurate, but for a macro view of the market, it is quite useful. And we were able to take the ComScore numbers, the ComScore visits, and match that against the publishers that we had. And we found a really high correlation between those two things, even though they were different numbers, which meant that we could do this math. And it's not surprising that would be the case, because ComScore, as you may know, they put tracking codes on all the publishers' websites. So the fact that the data from the publishers matched more or less the data from ComScore, that makes sense. So we wanted to isolate the news, right? So we separated out news articles from the rest of the web activity for the publishers. So we identified the URLs. We want to know the news that people are going to. So if someone clicks on a headline, that goes to an article page. We wanted to count those pages specifically, not the home page. The home page is important and useful and all that, but not for the purposes of understanding this relationship between publishers and platforms. So we're trying to isolate just the article pages and where that referral traffic is coming from, how it works, and all that. So we took those numbers, used this ComScore formula that we came up with to extrapolate the larger number, and came to the conclusion that there were 7 billion sessions to news articles. This is for Europe in January. All right, so this number is quite important. This might be the this is the foundation block to all this work, where we can figure out how much the relationship between platforms and publishers is worth. But this is where things get really interesting. Okay, so thank you for bearing with me through the math part of that first bit. But this is kind of starts to get more exciting. we wanted to know how many headlines people saw but did not click. This is a really interesting kind of thing to understand. Not because they didn't click it, but just trying to understand what's happening outside that you cannot see, that you have no understanding of what's going on. There are probably a few different ways to go about getting this data. We chose to do a survey and asked, I think there were about 25 questions. We tried to get people in, get in the headspace of what's a typical day like for you in terms of news. What's your relationship to news? Where are you getting it from? How many times a day? Where, just getting them thinking, where is your main source of news the internet, or is it TV or radio, or just starting to tease out some questions before we ask the critical question, which is on the next slide. But just to give you a little more background, this was a survey of 3,000 adults 18 years or older in Germany, France, and the UK. And the only qualifier was whether or not you had used any digital news source in the last 30 days, which was basically everybody. So these were the two critical questions. How many headlines do people see in a day? And what % of those headlines do you click? And there are a few questions around this idea of how many headlines people see in a day that we found absolutely fascinating. There's an appetite out there for news that I think people are not really recognizing. There's a lot of discussion about, oh, we can't find the audience we want. They're all going to this place and that place. We don't know where they are. I think we're underestimating the appetite for news. I think people are hungry, and I think they would consume a lot more if there were more ways to get it, actually, after doing this research. But the critical number is this: what % do you click? We came to the conclusion that it was 32% looking at the numbers. And the strange thing about this number, is 31.77% actually, was how consistent it was across various segments. So we thought, okay, is it different between male and female, or different ages, 18-year-olds versus 55 plus? It was remarkably consistent across all the different kind of slices we looked at across the data, this 32%. So you can see why I made that blue box a little bit fuzzy on the right, because we're asking people to say what % of the stories you click on or what % of the headlines did you see, did you actually click on? So that it makes it hard for it to feel like that's a real number. But this is a really large sample of people, and statistically, that 32% is the answer to that question. And I think this is the other number that's quite interesting to start thinking about. Why does everyone think that they click on about a third of the headlines that they see out there? Is that something that we should maybe think about how we move the needle? Make people feel, maybe they feel like they're not, we're often hard on ourselves in the news business, thinking, well, people don't really care about what we do. Well, they do, and maybe that's a number we can start to work on to try and get that perception to change. So we've got the 7 billion number of referrals to news sites that begin at a news article, and we know that that's 32% of the headlines that people see, and therefore, since 7 billion is 32% of 23 billion. So that's how we came up with that first number in that first slide, 23 billion total news exposures in Europe in January. All right? The next question is, how much is it worth? So again, those are big numbers to kind of throw around. What's the context for that? There are quite a few different kinds of contexts that we've been considering for this research. And we're a small team, so we have to kind of focus. And we thought the first one we would tackle would be about revenue and the economics of that number. So we looked at PricewaterhouseCoopers Global Entertainment and Media Outlook report, and they report a number for digital ad revenue for the news business. So in 2017, in Europe, this report says that there was 1.8 billion euros in digital ad revenue for the newspaper business. So this is not taking into account membership or subscriptions or events or any other revenue stream. This is purely digital advertising, display advertising in the news business in Europe in 2017. So that's kind of the core figure we work from to then start working out this really fun number. All right, so we wanted to know what was the value of a visit. What's the value of a visitor, of someone coming to a website? And the way we got to this was we took the 1.8 billion, so the annual figure was 1.8 billion, and we just wanted to look at January. So all our data that we're working with is January based. So 1 month of that is 152 million. So the revenue per session then is that 152 divided by the total number of sessions to news in January. And this is all sessions. We're trying to do apples to apples, right? So the Price Waterhouse number is digital ad revenue for all of newspapers, all news media. So we want to take all the traffic for all of news media in order to get this value of a session to a publisher. So it does include the homepage. It does include the index pages and microsites and all the other kinds of digital traffic, so that we can get this number at the bottom, 7/10 of 1 cent, which seems really small, right? You know, you've got a lot of zeros on that number, but keep in mind that the volume of traffic everyone is getting is remarkable, and I think that just kind of gets lost in a lot of these conversations. And that number gets big really fast. So because of that, we can take that 7 billion number figure, 7 billion referrals to news articles, and multiply it by this 7/10 of a cent number, and now we know the value. Now we know that the value of the relationship, to publishers at least, the value of the relationship between platforms and publishers is about 50 million euros a month. Right, so it's kind of, this starts to get quite fun, and you can start to see how this might play out in some really interesting ways, and we'll start teasing some of that out. One of the things I want to talk about in the panel is, can we grow that number? That seems like quite a big opportunity. That blue box on the right is pretty big. What can we do to help publishers more? But there's another aspect to this, which is that 53 million. It seems, it seems big and small in different kind of contexts. But it's also quite clear that we're not dealing with codependency. Publishers and platforms, they're not dependent on each other. The news business is generating a lot of money without the platforms. Now, this is not a small number. You need this number. You don't want to chuck it away. But you can survive without it. You're not dependent on the platforms to survive. So how do we start to do better with this box on the right? How does the news business start to think a little bit differently about how it can improve its position in this blue box? I think one of the things is understanding that you do have value that you can bring outside of the environments that you control, and I'm hoping that Mark will talk about some of this in the BBC context, because he's been thinking about it a lot. But people really do value the news brands, and they are more likely to click on a story if the original source is from a news source that they recognize. It's quite dramatic how people feel about that. And I know Nick has some interesting numbers on trust as well that I want to get to in a little bit. But this is the one that really, really struck me, this difference here. What this says is that people are using platforms. This is in the context of news, okay? So I'm not talking about all the different things you can do on third-party sites. I'm just talking about in the context of news. People are using platforms to get suggestions for stories to read. They want to be told. They want suggestions of things to go read, places to go read them. They want to be told that publisher X has a story that I am going to be interested in, and then they want to read that story with publisher X. They care about getting in-depth analysis. This is one of many things that people care about, but it's just the most striking. But they want the latest news from publishers. They want in-depth information on particular topics, on things that they're tracking. They value the publisher side of this equation a lot, and they're using the platform side of the equation to get there. That's not broken in my mind. It feels, the way people talk about the publisher-platform relationship, like it's dysfunctional. It's not dysfunctional. It might not be right the way it is today. It will always need to be better. You can always change it and fix it and do things to optimize for one side or the other, or a change in the market, or a new business model, new technology. There's always ways to improve it. It's not broken, right? It's working for people, it's working for platforms, and it's working for publishers on some level. Right, so the report and the methodology and all this kind of stuff will be coming out soon. I don't want to put a date on that because I'm sure I'll miss it if I do. And now I'd like to turn the conversation over to you guys and to my panelists here to talk about some of the issues around this, and to perhaps rephrase what we're talking about to include people, right? This is not just about publishers and platforms. That discussion needs to change. This is a three-legged stool here. People are the critical part of this, and they need to be served, or none of this is going to work. Right. So there are a few different ways we could start this conversation. I think one thing that would be useful would be to talk about that, how you kind of slide over into that blue box. So there are a few questions around that, like, how far is too far? But before we get there, how about, do you guys have thoughts on ways that publishers can start to take advantage of the fact that there is this ready-made kind of position for publishers on third-party sites?
Maybe just reflect on some of the stuff we just heard, which I think is really interesting and counter-narrative. So, you know, the sort of the narrative is platforms killing publishers, and what you're broadly saying is you don't need them as much as you think. You know, the narrative about platforms controlling distribution, maybe that's not quite true. You know, this is more about how this stuff works together. Is that right?
Yeah.
I think that's really significant, and it's not a lot of what we've heard in the rest of the conference is not fitting that narrative. It's not fitting what you've just said. And it also, I have to say, it bears out a lot of what we've found in our research. Now, this is not universal, so where I would slightly differ is I think that brands are valued in some countries, but not so much in other countries. So in the UK and Nordic countries, we find that people really value those brands. They go to the brands, they're much less dependent on the platforms, but they use the platforms effectively. But in some countries like Japan and Korea, I mean, the platforms are everything. You know, you have to go through the platforms to get that access. So I know you're looking at just Europe, and so in the European context, it's different. But yeah, I think this is really important, and it opens up all kinds of, you know, really interesting possibilities and discussion.
I think it's fascinating research, and I mean, look, Nick is absolutely right. There's a market dependency here, and we're very privileged in the UK because the BBC is particularly well known, and consequently, this underlines a lot of the experiences that we've already had. But you know, go to other parts of the world, and it's much more fragmented. So I think it isn't a universal picture. I think the one thing I would add, though, is that this distinction between a click-through and content that people are looking at, but that doesn't lead to that click-through experience. We have to have a little bit of literacy about types of news here, because, you know, in my world, we're publishing as much around breaking news, where, frankly, all you're giving people is a quick update on a story where they may not actually need to click through to anything. and other stories where, frankly, if they don't click through, they're not going to get even half the story. So there are different types. I was quite taken when you said this was your research bore fruit in terms of the entire news ecosystem. Yeah. You know, that this wasn't unique to one type of news or one type of market in news, because, you know, my experience is that about, well, I'd say over half the time, the news that we're actually giving people doesn't actually require that deeper relationship.
Uh-huh. How about in the audience? So we've got lots of people working at some interesting organizations, lots of publications. Any comments on that, on bringing value outside of the context of your owned and operated properties? Any particular experiences people have? Yeah.
I think it's really, really interesting. Sorry, I'm from CNN. Hi, Blonid, Healy. I think the one area where I think it gets quite challenging, though, for us is how do we think about growing audiences in markets where maybe our brands aren't recognized, so where we don't have that trust relationship, and where we're working in, I think, which is kind of what Mark, maybe you were alluding to, markets that are very saturated by the platforms. So thinking about the Philippines and other markets where it's in the 90% plus category, where Facebook has, you know, Facebook is in some ways seen as the internet. And how you kind of get around that. So I think it's fascinating report in the context of Europe, and I would love to kind of see it expanded beyond that, to try and, you know, bring the learnings from some of the other parts of the world, African countries, and into Asia, and kind of to Nick's point around the sort of the relationship between publishers and platforms being so different. I think it would be great to see some further research on this, but this is really interesting, and I think it is a counter narrative, and it's an important counter narrative, because, you know, we can't sort of sit in a very specific place with this conversation. I think we have to continue to challenge it, and not sort of, you know, put platforms in one place as an industry. So I think it's a really valuable contribution to that wider discussion.
Just on that point, actually, as an illustration, we set up a Thai Facebook page not that long ago, and started to pump a considerable amount of content to that page, and we discovered in a fairly short order that we were getting more traffic back to our website as a consequence of having a Facebook page than we had previously, when we were less willing to put all our content on a Facebook page in that same way. So that's just one example of a brand recognition issue that we had in one part of the world, where the platform played an absolutely critical part, both in terms of reaching that audience and driving them back into our site.
I'd maybe just add to that is we did some independent research on the brand, so we took it down to brand level, and what we see, so not only do you have differences between countries, but you have very big differences between brands. So in the UK, we just did it in the UK, and we were actually tracking people and asking people 24 hours later, you know, do you remember the brand, but also looking at where they come from to stories. So did you come directly, did you come from search, or did you come from social? And in the UK, you know, the BBC was around sort of 80%, but other brands like The Sun and The Independent were around sort of Huffington Post around 15%. So you can see massive difference in terms of the extent to which individual brands are dependent on third parties or not for their traffic and for their revenues. And yet even those big brands like the BBC, which has 80% in the UK, as I'm sure Mark will say, outside the UK, you know, they're down in the 10 or 12% direct traffic, because they're fundamentally having to be discovered through distributed, and the same for you and CNN. So strategies need to be different. The same organisation needs to think differently about distributed, depending on their market position in particular countries.
Yeah.
Hello, I'm Antonio. I work for RAI, the public broadcast, Italian broadcasting, as a social media editor for RAI 3. I have a question for you, Matt, in addition to what Mark says before. Do you have some data about the kind of headlines you analyzed? I mean, I think that there should be some differences about the kind of news, of course. But I mean, do you have some data about the kind of headlines? I mean, for example, clickbaiting headlines, or some kind of things of headline that it has been clicked a lot.
Yeah, I don't have data specific to headlines, but there is some interesting stuff. I did bring a couple of slides of a few excerpts of the report, and we asked a few different kinds of questions that were sort of around this, but not specifically around headlines. But we were asking them to rate on a scale of 1 to 10 how interested people are in different types of news. And this was one of the kind of setup questions before we got to that. What % of the headlines do you click on? So we're trying to get in people's heads a little bit. And there was some kind of interesting differences between UK, France, and Germany. And again, this is only UK, France, and Germany. We didn't interview, the survey didn't run outside of those countries. But it's striking how people rate these things and how more interested people say they are in Germany in like all the categories. Why are they so much more interested? Is that a cultural thing? Is it real? Are the Brits just maybe less willing to say they're interested in anything? Is it there are a few different things, but when you put these things on relative terms, it does become interesting. I was also surprised at how far football fell on the uninteresting category, because I was at the Guardian for 8 years, and there was one rule, like you never talk about the football link in the navigation. That is going to be there. I'm sorry, there's an end of discussion. Really? Maybe that doesn't bear out. Maybe has this changed? Maybe things have changed in the market. I don't really know what this means.
Split that by gender, you'll see some very different examples.
Less than you would think, right? That's what I thought at first. So I looked at the gender split, and it is surprising how similar male and female responses were to this particular question. Do you have anything to add on that? On the content?
No.
Okay. Yes.
Hi, Jane Barrett from Reuters. We were chatting yesterday a bit about how there's been kind of a war of words going on, certainly from publishers towards platforms, and kind of a silky smooth answer coming back from platforms to publishers. I love the fact you've got the three-legged stool with people, because frankly, society's changing and we can't turn back a clock, and genie's out of the bottle, and lots of other phrases that we could come up with. And I'd be really interested to hear from all of you, really, just about how you see the kind of the next wave of consumer behaviour, particularly as we're looking at the younger generation. Typically one thinks, oh, the teenagers are on Snapchat. Well, are they really? Or are, as Mark was saying, are they actually now moving into more of the chat places? And so where do we need to be thinking about putting our creativity and our attention in order to be able to make sure that those pieces of news are getting to the audience and therefore giving us an opportunity to get money back?
Yes. All right. I know both of you have a lot of thoughts on that, so I'm going to hand it over to you. But one thing I do want to comment on: let's not forget the old people.
Yeah.
Right? Because we found amazing data in the 55+ category about how hungry they are for news. But yes, you want to talk about?
Yeah. Great question. I mean, you're right about the old people as well, by the way. I mean, we don't have a problem with old people at the BBC, but we might have a problem with old people if we go too far. It's a bit like sort of the communism to capitalism, I was saying to somebody the other day, we have a tendency as journalists to continually try to reinvent the wheel and say we've got a problem, so we need to push everything into one direction and solve it, and then we have a women problem, if I can put it that way, at the BBC in lots of different ways. And I think that there is an opportunity here, and I think I'd put it in those terms, to try and reach audiences in a variety of ways. And what I was saying earlier about closed networks is not that we need to abandon the open networks, but we need to think about networks as being more than just Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. They are opportunities to reach audiences in different ways with your content, but they're not necessarily building a relationship. You're not actually building a loyalty necessarily there unless you can develop the conversation. To your point about Snapchat, I mean, Nick's got the data on this, but actually there's not a lot of news consumption going on there. You might think, you read a lot of the press and you would think if everyone had a Snapchat Discover account that the world would be a better place in terms of our ability to reach young people. I think that's a fallacy. I think that a lot of organizations have put huge resources into building teams to deliver content into Snap, only to discover that they actually were not necessarily moving the dial particularly. What we're looking at doing is thinking about, so take Instagram as an example. Is there an opportunity not just to push 1-minute videos and pictures to audiences on an Instagram feed, but think about bringing your newsletter into an Instagram story? So for example, every day we now produce an email newsletter that we also break down as an Instagram story and add hyperlinks to it to encourage people to delve deeper. And then as they comment, we respond to the comments. So that's, just thinking in a more granular way about that activity. With Facebook groups, we're thinking much more about how we can use them not just as opportunities to reach different audiences around subjects, but to develop a conversation with that audience and think about them both in terms of bringing content back into the BBC, but also as opportunities to have conversations that you would never otherwise be able to have. But the challenge that it then produces for us is the diversity of our newsroom. I'll give you one small example of this. We created a teen mums Facebook group for the BBC Education and Family Facebook page the other day, which was a closed group, invite only, and I'm an administrator of that page. Now, you might think that I was a teen mum, but I can assure you that I've never been a teen mum and never will be. How do you, if you're looking at your newsroom, how do you ensure that in trying to develop these conversations in communities that you're also able to participate in them if you don't have the diversity in your newsroom in the first instance? So it's really challenging, and it's forcing us to question a whole lot of assumptions about how we're organised.
I would say there are kind of two trends, really, if I look forward. So one is, the internet kind of blew up habit and fragmented audiences, as we know. And I think what publishers are trying to do is to put that back together again. And I think audiences actually are crying out for that as well. So people who are interested in news want to have habits and apps and go back regularly. And we need to get much better at building those experiences because Facebook and Google have done that really well and publishers haven't. So I think that's one key trend. The problem is there's a whole load of people who won't come to you, and many young people or people who are less interested in news. And so particularly for public service broadcasters, but for many others, how do you reach those people? And that's where you need to use those networks. That's where you need to think about creating native content for those networks, working out how to bring them into a news environment. So for me, it's always been about a two-tier strategy. It's about destination and distribution and how you think collectively about bringing those things together.
Yeah.
There is a conversation when you create the Instagram stories from the newsletter on BBC channel of Instagram. People go to the website or interact with them. There is a conversation and engagement with the people that saw the Instagram stories and then go to the website and other things. There is a conversation, the engagement.
The conversation is actually on Instagram. It's not necessarily on the website, but I think there's 2 points. One is that we've seen...
Sorry,
go on. Yeah.
When you create an Instagram stories, you can put the link and so people can see more. People go to the website or remain on Instagram?
They go to the website.
How many?
So we only start...
I know BBC is a great... yes. So a number of people. How many?
Yeah. So we started doing this in February. So it's quite new, and Instagram stories have not been around for very long either. But our referral traffic from Instagram was in the small thousands, if I can put it that way, and we're now looking at the hundreds of thousands. and that's just in 6 weeks. So, you know, it's a growth area for us. I mean, it's not a panacea. Facebook remains a dominant force in referral traffic for us, but there is still, I think there's a growing opportunity there.
And in the group, in the Facebook groups, the activity when you produce a lot of things from a page, so on the page you can produce 5 posts a day, on a group you can produce a lot of things. The conversation remains on the groups or go to the website?
That's a very good question. I mean, it depends on the nature of the group, if it's a closed or an open group. But
how many groups do you have with BBC?
Are you doing a research project on us?
No,
so,
it's useful.
No, sure.
I work with him in the RAI.
Oh, okay.
So we look at the Facebook groups as a part of interaction with the people that used to see our programs, and the Facebook group is it's opportunity. So we can conversate with all people. Different way from the page. With the page is an institutional page, so we can produce 5 posts a day, 1 post on a week from the program. But with the groups, you can produce a lot of things, things that you cannot produce on the institutional page.
So we're producing. In terms of the numbers of groups, we have. I can't actually put a number to it at the moment because they're growing all the time. But we've got about a dozen different Facebook groups now across our main pages, and then more if you look at our regional pages. And in those groups, they're a combination of open and closed. Some of the closed groups are closed simply because they're topics that are potentially vulnerable, or we're trying to protect the audience to some extent around the conversation. And in those closed groups, we have to be more sensitive about how we use the stories. So it could be that we create an environment to allow them to talk about something over a matter of weeks, and then over time the administrators go in and invite them to expand on what they're saying, and then we produce an article or a video that gets posted back onto the page. So it's not necessarily a daily endeavor, but it sometimes can take a bit of time.
So when you play in these groups, when you produce a story, people comment on the story, and you can create an article on website from the story they comment.
Yeah.
Amazing.
We've got a couple of questions over here in the second or third row there.
Second row?
Third row.
Hi, this is Osman from BBC Turkish Service. Should we define the metrics and the term engagement again? Imagine people like Mark just mentioned, like vulnerable people who are not eager to share or comment, maybe not on a post on social media. So imagine videos normally the metrics are just defined by share, comment, and whatever. Just you need to click. Always there's an obsession with the click. So you create videos subtitled, you explain what's going on the video in 2 minutes or 3 minutes. You can see how many people just watched 95% of the video. If that audience haven't just contacted any click or nothing, he didn't or she didn't do anything about that, but just watched, you're not just calling it as an engagement. Do you think that this is a problematic approach to the metrics?
Massive problem. I totally agree with you. And I think, I've got to say, I really don't trust the numbers that come from the platforms for the most part.
Neither do I.
I've got several examples from Facebook. So video views on Facebook, we've seen cases where the number of views for a particular video are several orders of magnitude larger than the number of engagements. And that might be possible now and again, but the number of times that comes up makes me think that they're just not related at all. And they, again, I don't want to harp on one platform over the others, but Facebook, they changed the way they report their engagements dramatically. So a year and a half ago, they had one system for doing it, and then they announced that they were going to kind of change things in the footnote of blog post. And then 6 months later, the change happened. And what they were doing is they used to, when you get the engagement counts from Facebook, the numbers has been sampled. They're not actually reporting back the actual number of engagements, and an engagement being a share, a comment, or a reaction. So they weren't reporting the actual number. It was just a sample. So out of 1,000, we figure it's about this many. And then suddenly they are reporting the real numbers, and it had a dramatic effect on what everyone is seeing in the market. But the strange thing was, it didn't really upset anyone's business model. So the engagements actually are meaningless, aren't they? So I think there's a real problem there.
I think part of the problem is publishers need to take much more control of metrics themselves, about what it is they're trying to do. So going back to that idea that you need to basically optimize your site for your loyal readers. That's one set of metrics. And then what you're doing in social media is probably something different. And you need to define for yourself what that is. Is it about attracting people for referrals? Is it about exposing and marketing? And then your metrics that you will choose based on what's available within platforms will be different. So, I mean, the thing I always say is you have to take this back to the core. Otherwise, you will waste loads of time, and you won't be able to compare what is working and what isn't if you don't.
Provided you can measure it. I mean, the other thing that we haven't talked about, which is something I was talking to Matt earlier about, was we had a video the other day. We live streamed on YouTube the congressional hearing with Mark Zuckerberg, and I was just speaking to our YouTube editor yesterday, and she was saying, well, several thousand of the views, because YouTube can give you this stat, were people who took the link and placed it onto WhatsApp. Now, I don't know, having placed that link onto WhatsApp, how many further views that live stream will have produced as a consequence of people sharing it from within WhatsApp. So we're already into a kind of dark social experience here, where we can only actually measure what the platforms are providing us with.
Just to build on that, we've just done some focus groups. We're going to reveal some of this in the digital news report later this year, about dark social, essentially. So what is going on there, and how's it being used? And it is absolutely fascinating. So this idea of either taking links sometimes, or in other cases, taking screenshots. You've probably done it yourself. People just take a whole load of screenshots of what's going on in their Twitter feeds or of a particular news story, and then they place that and have a discussion about it. So we're seeing far more discussion, far more sort of bits of news content, if you like, going into a place where it is not measurable. And maybe we can find proxies for that, or we can find ways of thinking about that, and it's valuable stuff, by Matt's metrics. But that's another complication that we're going to need to think about increasingly as we see this move to dark social.
Yeah, actually, I'll take a question here, but then there's an issue I want to bring up before we run out of time. Go ahead.
I have a question about your data. You have asked people how many times in a month they have clicked on headlines.
We asked them in a typical day.
In a typical
day, what your experiences are. How many headlines do you see in a typical day? What percentage of those headlines do you click on?
Yes, because I thought that it was for a month or a week. And from medical data, I know that people are usually not very good to report how the amount of alcohol or the number of cigarettes they smoke. So it usually it's very. They have seen from epidemiological data that is quite good to ask for a week or a day. Otherwise, people are quite give a very, very bad data.
Yeah, I think it's. Look, I agree. It's hard to get. It's hard to put real numbers against that kind of a question. But the striking thing was, and I mentioned this before, is just the consistency of that number. It was consistently across different segments, about a third of the headlines that people see, they say they click on. I think there's something quite interesting about that, how consistent it was. Okay, so I'll get your question in a second, but one thing I do want to raise before we run out of time is decision making. So who in the organization on a news publisher is part of that decision about how you engage with third parties? I think it's quite a tricky thing. So from my experience at The Guardian a few years ago, I remember a few meetings where there were multiple meetings. I don't think this is unique to The Guardian. There were multiple meetings trying to decide what the committee was called to work on the decision about how The Guardian was to deal with the platforms. And I'm curious how other people deal with this. What data is being used to decide what the strategy is for dealing with the platforms? Is there different data that's being used by different departments? How is that working? Or not working?
Yeah, I mean, we like committees at the BBC too, but we have an audience engagement team now, and that was built not that long ago for precisely that reason, so that we could try to synchronize our thinking when it came to data strategy, to Nick's point about figuring out what we should be measuring where, how often, on what platforms and so on. So we do have a much more centralized, structured approach to this now. The difficulty is the platforms themselves keep evolving. So, I had a conversation with somebody just the other week who said, could you outline the strategy again for the umpteenth time? And I said, well, you do realize that we've had these, newsfeed changes from Facebook. And I think they'd been on holiday and they hadn't sort of seen the press. And so I said, you can't just read a document and then put it in a drawer and that's the end of it. And that's the big problem that we have, is that, in big organizations, you need to keep reinforcing and communicating over and over again. But people need to be a bit self-starting about this too.
And Nick, you've talked to people about this kind of issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some new structures like audience engagement teams which are working in some places, but in other places it's just a mess. I mean, essentially the whim of some senior editor who's in power to create a Snapchat channel because they think it's the latest cool thing they should do, and this is going on rampantly, and so people, publishers are wasting a lot of resources, and I do think that it is partly about gut feel, it's partly about your vision for your organization, and that has to be informed by data in some much more intelligent way, which, as I said before, starts with what are the core metrics you're trying to move, how does it relate to your business model, and then you work back from that rather than starting with the shiny new thing.
Anyone want to talk about their experience at their publication?
She had a different question.
You have a different question, don't you?
Hi, I work on a television and radio company in Spain, in Barcelona, and I'm carrying a team that it's called a new platforms team. What we do is we try to be the one settling down the strategy, but we also try to have like one of our people in every newsroom in the company. So we have someone in sports, we have someone in fiction, we have someone in entertainment, in classical radio station, everywhere. So we try to really coordinate our information, because our main problem is that we can be settling down strategy every day, but the information never reach like the whole capillarity of the system. And you have like 400 people publishing in social media who need to be aware of what are we supposing to do today or tomorrow. And our main focus this year actually is working not so much in strategy, because that's something that fortunately we have get the way to keep on like updating it, and we're okay with that. But our main focus is to work on communication inside the organization, so everyone really gets the information that they need and they get feedback about their actions. That's something that it's really hard to give also for people who's directly on the ground. Because maybe on more central positions, we have a clear vision of what's going on because we have direct access to the data, we are asking for the data, but the people who's really working in daily basis, they are more blind to that, so yeah, we are working on that.
That's a really, really good point about feedback, and I cannot emphasize enough. I mean, I'm having these battles myself. I keep saying to people at the BBC, let's stop focusing on the viral hit and start talking about the things that didn't work. Because there is way too much, and I see this in other organizations too, way too much focus when it comes to data at looking at some new fad or some new story that had kind of hit the top of the charts, and it could simply be a set of very, very local circumstances to do with breaking news, and actually have no sort of big takeaway for your organisation. And I think that actually focusing on the things that didn't push through and why they didn't push through, and was it to do with the location of the story, the way it was sold, the SEO, but those kind of things are absolutely critical to get right.
Yeah, totally agree. So what we are doing also in that sense is we are trying to get the eyes of our people out of the data that they get directly from the platforms, because the community manager that is on one Facebook page is only seeing what is happening to that post, and we're trying to create like a common dashboard that is aggregating data from Comscore, from Site Catalyst, and from platforms themselves, so we can fix what are the key metrics that we want the organization to be focused on, but very selected key metrics, like 4 or 5, with the, very clear KPIs.
That's a trend across the industry, is to create your own dashboard, create your own metrics that work for you, and bring in the data from other places to enable that to happen. I think that's something. There's a question over there.
Yeah.
There was a question in the back.
There's a lady at the back, yeah.
Hello. I'm a data scientist with like a keen interest in sort of the meta aspect of the news. And often you see these kind of charts where you see these topics or keywords have been covered over time compared with what is actually important, to put it in quotes. Now this metric, looking at what people clicked at, you can see in comparison what news outlets think should be covered versus what people read and is covered maybe more than observed and over-expected. And so from that you can see the delta of things that have been undercovered or overcovered. And I guess if you're a news organization that just optimizes for clicks or is sort of has a business model on advertisement or something, then it's kind of easy to optimize for that. But my question is, for the BBC or places that have like this mission to inform and educate, etc., how do you address this delta between user engagement and interest and people who are educated in news and politics, etc., and who kind of have a better gauge on what's important? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, it's a good question. If I had the answer, look, I think you can't put all your eggs in one basket, is probably my answer, in that I think that the value of what Matt's outlined for us is that it's an opportunity to be able to reach some interesting calculations and to, off the back of that, be a bit more informed when it comes to a certain segment of your audience. But you've got to be mindful that the audience isn't one thing. You know, you're trying to reach some people who might be light news consumers at the same time as you're mindful that you don't want to lose the people that are heavier news consumers. And we have this problem in spades at the BBC because, you know, at the same time that we understand we've got a younger audience issue in that there are audiences that just don't come directly to us, and this could be an opportunity. We also know that there are educated, very well-informed audiences who don't necessarily need that click-through experience in the same way, but they do need information to be presented differently. And that's a big challenge for us because, you know, you don't want to end up playing to the kids and pissing off the, you know, the 50-somethings at the same time.
I'll just have a quick go at that. I think that the importance of a news organisation knowing what it believes in as well is incredibly important, as well as being cognizant of data and using data effectively. And it's a question of how you do that. And I think part of it is you have to split down things and tag things appropriately so you can measure things by different standards. So, for example, for a public broadcaster I was working with, they were particularly interested in the impact that they made around really big and important stories that were going to shape the nation. And so what they did was they tagged those stories and then they measured how effective those stories were, both in social media but also on their own site. But also then they tagged celebrity stories or other types of stories differently. So you could, for example, see how you could have a strategy to get people engaged through celebrity stories on social media, and then they would highlight more effectively the powerful mission-driving stories as a first click, as a next click, to see how you could move the needle to what it is you're trying to do. So I think, again, everything comes back to having a clear view of what you're trying to do with the content rather than treating it as this big mass of content, because it isn't.
I want to close with one final question, or actually want Mark to expand on something that we were discussing over lunch, which is the implications of what's going on with Facebook now and Cambridge Analytica. So, and this is related to the question about what kind of metrics we can and should expect, or metrics that we want from these third parties. So if we want this relationship to work, if we do buy into this idea that it's important to have some cooperation going on between publishers and platforms, it does mean that the platforms need to come to the table with some information. And the data that we've been getting is not great. It might be getting, there's a threat that it could get worse. Do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I was sitting in a panel yesterday, and I tweeted that there was a trend that I was observing around the conference, which was that people were beginning to worry about lockdown. And, you know, it's that instinct that we have in human nature where we want to attack. It's like a sort of frightened animal, and the animal sort of dives into a cave and suddenly stops cooperating with us. And I'd liken that to what's going on a little bit with Facebook at the moment. We're in attack mode as journalists. We don't understand what's going on. We're hitting out. The public is hitting out. There's a tendency in those circumstances for data to get locked down too. And I think there's a risk that that some of us will find our jobs harder if, in the pursuit for data protection, which is an important and valuable and, you know, really essential pursuit, we start to demand so much that the social media companies feel that they can no longer cooperate and provide the kind of asks that we've been going for. So, for example, demographic data. That's something that I sorely need and want, and other publishers do. I'm sure everybody in this room would like to see more demographic data supplied around posts that you publish to social media platforms, including Facebook. We've had an ongoing conversation there for a while. There is a real risk that some of that conversation could stall because of our demands for privacy and lockdown and all the things that we've been discussing in association with Cambridge Analytica. And I think it's a very real risk that we need to guard against. Because certainly when it comes to UGC content as well, you know, if we're trying to track a story, how it's uploaded, how people are sharing it, what its provenance is, all those kind of things, and the platforms are wary of hate speech, terror-related content, and they don't have sufficient manpower to deal with it from a human perspective, and they become over-reliant on machines for all of the decision-making associated with that. The danger is that all of this material will simply be removed and no longer available for us as journalists to investigate. So I think that's a real risk.
Nick, do you want to add anything?
Not particularly. I mean, yeah, there's a risk of this, and I think the key thing is that publishers need to be, they're often not reasonable in the type of requests they have for data. They need to be very clear about what they want. Obviously, it's the anonymized data that we're looking for, and they need to agree on what the top 3 or 4 things are, and lobby for them effectively.
Yeah. Okay, Nick, Mark, thank you very much, and thank you all for joining us.